When the fullness of time came, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order that he might redeem those under the law. In writing these words, Paul uses a Greek word, chronos, which can be understood as reflecting chronological time, to describe how God interacted with human history to fulfill his redemptive plan in the birth of Christ. Certainly, Jesus' coming was a divine moment in human history, a one-of-a-kind, a kairos kind of event in which God was acting supernaturally. But the birth of Christ also reflected the fulfillment of God's ongoing plans in human history as he worked through various events to provide for the optimum moment of the incarnation. The world into which Jesus was born was uniquely prepared for the coming of Christianity and its rapid expansion. This is evident in the contributions of various cultures to the climate of the times. The Greeks contributed to the philosophical and intellectual climate. The Koine language provided a common means of communication. Much of the New Testament was written in Koine Greek. Koine Greek was the language of commerce. The philosophical thinking of the Greeks will provide the framework for people to think in terms of monotheism rather than polytheism. It will also be instrumental in shaping some of the forms that theology will take as it develops. The Romans, however, provided the political climate for the coming of Jesus through a unified empire, a well-developed system of roads, and the Pax Romana, which brought peace to the countries surrounding the Mediterranean. The Jews provided the theological foundation for Christianity with a belief in a monotheistic God who was active in the world, a messianic hope, and an ethical system of laws and religious practices. All of these factors indicate that the coming of Jesus was not simply a coincidence, but rather reflected God's redemptive plan unfolding throughout history. God was working through the history and culture of that time. God's purposes were evident not only in the positive influence of culture in helping to promote the Christian faith, but also in the way God enabled the people of faith to withstand the negative attacks of culture. While the early church experienced a phenomenal rate of expansion as the message of Christ was shared with the world they knew at the time, they did face their fair share of challenges. Persecution from the Jewish religious leaders and persecution from the Romans were immediate challenges that served to strengthen the faith of the early followers of Christ. One of the watershed moments in Roman persecution for both Jews and Christians was the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Tension between the Jews and their Roman overlords were growing ever stronger. The completion of the Jewish temple in AD 64 put thousands of laborers out of work, adding to the general discontent. Finally, in AD 66, the Jews revolted. They signaled their intent by refusing to perform the daily sacrifice for the emperor. As one account describes it, the tragic bloody war that followed cost more lives than any previous conflict. The Jews held out against overwhelming odds for 4 years, but they could not withstand the power of Rome. In AD 70, Emperor Vespasian's forces, led by Titus, broke through the walls of Jerusalem, looted and burned the temple, and carried off the spoils to Rome. The holy city was totally destroyed. In the reprisals that followed, every synagogue in Palestine was burned to the ground. At the start of the revolt, the leaders of the Jerusalem church were advised in a vision to flee the city. This event would be pivotal in the Jewish faith, as with the destruction of the temple and the altar at Jerusalem, sacrifices for sin would no longer be offered. Jewish law required that sacrifices be offered at the temple in Jerusalem. This event would also mark a turning point for Christianity as well. Most of the original disciples of Jesus were martyred by this time. According to tradition, John would be the only one to live till near the end of this century. In addition, many in the Roman world considered Christians to simply be a sect of Judaism. So as tension between Jews and Rome intensified, Christians would be caught up in the persecution. After the death of the original apostles, the church would be led by various leaders who would be later known by the term church fathers. They are identified in 3 groups. The apostolic church fathers lived at the time of the apostles or shortly thereafter, into the early part of the 2nd century. They were believed to have known the apostles or been significantly influenced by them. The ante-Nicene church fathers came after the apostolic church fathers and made their primary contribution to Christianity prior to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. The post-Nicene church fathers made their primary contribution to Christianity after the Council of Nicaea and up to the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD. Much of what we know of the early history of the church between the time of the New Testament writings up to the reign of Constantine comes to us from the writings of the church fathers. Through their writings, we gain a better understanding of some of the theological issues confronting the church as it was developing. Something about the liturgy of the church. The New Testament doesn't provide much in the way of a defined liturgy or practice of worship and ministry. Insights into the organizational structure of the early church. The church fathers more fully defined the development of the role of the bishop. Bishop served like the lead pastor of a local church, overseeing staff and volunteers or several churches. We also learn about the development of the monarchical bishop, who would oversee the work of several bishops and their churches. We also see the development of the Bishop of Rome as a kind of first among equals, which will pave the way for the formation of the papacy. The church fathers also give insight into more fully defined guidelines for the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper. And finally, the church fathers give us a better understanding of the development of the canon of the New Testament. They describe for us which books would be included and when they were included in use for worship within the early church. The contributions of the church fathers to our understanding of the development of the early church is incredibly important. By the end of the 1st century, the early church has moved well beyond the geographical boundaries of Jerusalem and Judea. Churches were planted throughout the Roman Empire, even to the city of Rome itself. Jesus declared that he would build his church upon the rock of Peter's declaration that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God. The Holy Spirit carried out that work through the dedicated leaders of the early church to make sure the mission of Jesus continued. God continued to build his church using the contributions of culture and overcoming the opposition of all that the powers of evil would attempt to do to hinder or destroy that work.